Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name's Claudia McCarthy. I'm the National Membership Services Manager here at the Institute. And tonight's presentation is brought to you by SONA, the Student Organised Network for Architecture, and the Institute's Emerging Architects and Graduates Network, known as EmAGN. Very pleased to welcome tonight's speaker, Tony McBurney. Tony is an architect and founding director of architectural practice Integrated Design Group, located in New South Wales. With 40 years of architectural practice, the last 20 of those establishing Integrated Design Group, Tony has been exploring the expression of relationships through the medium of architecture. His career began in the public service and progressed through private industry for corporate, private and institutional clients. Government agencies continue to seek Tony's input in expert teams of change makers. With a passion to help rural communities find good ways into a diversified future, he moved to Bathurst in regional New South Wales with his wife Sarah in 1996. Tony believes the principles that founded strong communities can be interpreted and transitioned toward capitalising these strengths for a future that builds on local character in the process of growth. Tony has provided insights in urban design and built form, issues that are very important to regional towns and villages. Tonight, Tony's presentation will respond to these important questions, including, is architecture just an artful indulgence patronised by the rich, or is there a meaningful career to be pursued by idealists wanting to serve humanity? And architecture can communicate ideas and relationships through the language of space. What do we want to say and who do we want to talk with? And I'll now hand over to Tony. Thanks, Tony.
Well, good evening. Great to be with you. I'll share my screen and go straight to a presentation. Oops, if I can find it. So I often talk with students who reach about fourth year in a very long course, and they wonder why they would continue to pursue becoming an architect. Is it worth going on doing the second degree, the master's, doing all those things, and building a career? Is there a career to be built in architecture? And if so, why would you bother being an architect? And I think the why question is the important question for architects. We need to understand what it is that we're doing. Very often our profession is seen more as a beauty contest than serving humanity. And I guess I'd like to talk to you tonight more about purpose and meaning. Hopefully, in your time at university, you've already met the bubble diagram or the relationship diagram. It's at this level that we can begin to engage with the purpose of what it is that we're doing. This is a great tool. I know that there are people there who are interested to understand how do you move from a blank page into the beginning of an idea. And this is still, even for me, 40 years on, this is still the first of the building blocks. It's where we get to map out the component parts of any particular brief and where we start to explore how those component parts relate to one another. Now, I'm using diagrams here from Paul Lassault from his book, Graphic Thinking for Architects and Designers. It's one of the textbooks I bought, I think, when I was at university, and it's one that I'd still recommend to you now. And I've put the reference down the bottom there so that you can go and find it in a bookshop somewhere. It is still available on the internet. I found it today. But the movement from that first relationship of the component parts into ordering those parts so that they start to get spatial relationships. We start to develop hierarchy. We start to lay them out in a way that responds to perhaps climate or prospect, to various other opportunities. We might sort them according to zoning of particular parts. We start to bring order and deliberate purpose to the relationships that we've understood from the first diagram. After that, we can then start to add structure and geometry and grid systems to that. Again, we can get more specific about progression particularly from public to the most private. In this case, this example being a house. But there are all those sort of progressions that move through buildings and different zones of buildings. And our relationship diagram progresses its way through to an exploration of this sort of arrangement in space. And ultimately, that then becomes a plan. Very often we try to do these things back to front, and if you hand an architectural question to a non-architect, then they will always start here in the familiar space of plans and diagrams, and they won't ever have figured out this key component, which is what are the relationships that we're looking to express, to define and to enliven in our work. So as I said, even now 40 years on in practice, I still use these same diagrams to mind map what it is that I'm doing. On the left there you see the results of what was actually a live session with our client in a design workshop, briefing workshop that we were having with them. This was as we began the Rail Museum here in Bathurst with the local council. My iPad was connected to their large screen and I was scribbling in live time as people sort of started to download what the component parts of the brief would be, and we started to explore how those component parts would relate together. Now, I always use this as a system to make sure that our buildings work, and that's one of the great compliments that we receive is when we've done some motor dealerships, for example, which are interestingly complex operational buildings. And one of our clients once remarked that when we design their buildings, his staff move in and they just start to get on with their work. Whereas often they move into new buildings and the staff move in and start to try to make the building work for them. And so it's always been important to us that our buildings operate well and work well, and this relationship diagram is a key part of that. In this, for this Rail Museum, having gone through this process, and the diagram on the left became the diagram on the right, where we started to organise the component parts of the space, and then became this planning arrangement. And as recently as last week, in front of an awards jury, our client said to us, one of the great things about this building is that they arrive in the morning, they open the door, they switch on the lights, and then it all starts to operate. And that's because we've been through that rigour of figuring out how the building should work in the first place. And yet, those operational components are not the only way in which buildings work. This image shows you a complex of buildings that we're in the process really still of working on in Uganda. This is just near the head of the Nile in the city of Jinja, or just out of the city of Jinja, a project for an organisation called EmAGN. And when we first walked the site with the founder of this organisation, a young girl, an American girl who deliberately moved to Uganda instead of going to university, and set up a program where she is involved in reinforcing the community, particularly through mentoring children and providing them with education. And this is their secondary school campus. When we walked on this site with her first, I asked her to define her project in terms of a couple of words for me. And she described the project as being characterised by peace and plenty. And so on this rural hillside, we set about arranging a school campus that would represent for her peace and plenty. And so the arrangement of the buildings and the component parts all relate to one another for that more esoteric objective, but that really is the brief for this building. It has all sorts of operational requirements as well, but it needed to speak those particular things. Because function is much more than just operation. And we look to create functional buildings, and people will critique our buildings according to their function, but they need to understand that function goes beyond just the operation of a building. Because the purpose of the building carries with it reason that stands behind the actions that we might take in creating it. Reason is rational thinking. And reason, though, can include esoteric and metaphysical characteristics, not just operational ones, as I've said. So a functional design is one that achieves its full purpose, and I've written those words across the image on the screen there, and this is one of the corners of the children's space in the Rail Museum, and it's a space that I had to fight for. You can imagine trying to get a 2.5-storey triangular wedge out of the corner of a simple shed that's on a tight budget. And the builder came along and said, "Oh, no, we can do this much cheaper if we just cut all that down and chop it all up and reduce that back, make it smaller, shorter, all those sorts of things," and told the client how much money they were going to save. And I manned up for the first time in a 40-year career and sort of said, no, actually the purpose of this building is to, includes inspiring young children around the subject and within this this children's discovery space that we're creating. And so this component part of that purpose is just as important as a whole range of other things and deserves a place within the budget. We do some work in ecclesiastical architecture. Here you see the entrance to new entrance that we've created to a very old building, a building that used to be kind of exclude the public pretty poorly, which doesn't work very well with the current mission of the church. The arrangement of these things matter, and so we crafted an entry ramp and a new entrance door and all sorts of things in this building, so that our arrangement could speak to people in a welcoming way and welcome people in, because our arrangement of architectural elements does speak to people, and it does influence the behaviour and the relationships that are able to be expressed and inspired. It also informs our perceptions and our value judgments as we approach and read buildings. And so you see buildings like the Bathurst Courthouse, which built in 1870 odd, about the same time as my house here in Bathurst. In fact, it was planted here as a statement of the progression of regional development, where this frontier of civilization, of law and order, from a Western civilization imposing itself on a continent as Macquarie's dream was being realised. And so this building stands as a statement of the imposition of law and order. And so its strong symmetry and its power and its force stand as a testament to that purpose that had been declared 60 years earlier by the governor. I didn't get to put some images in here, sorry, of schools, but you can imagine there are sort of 3 different types of schools as I've categorised them. There are the, I guess, the Ivy League schools, which often will show you a great big building and formal steps up to them, something similar to that courthouse, and that tells you exactly the kind of school you're about to enter. There are other schools who set grand buildings behind a sort of a playing field, and you get the sense that rugby is at the centre of their competitive advantage. And then there are other schools which romantically set, amongst the parkscape. Universities, you find the same way. Newcastle University was deliberately planted in amongst the parkscape originally. They're now establishing a campus in the centre of city, which is much more commercially bombastic. These things speak about the objectives and the character of the places that they're standing for. But with purpose actually comes meaning. And I wanted to just run you through something, again, that I learned at university, which has stood by me right throughout my career. And I find a very useful set of tools in just understanding the language of space. Because I believe that architecture is the concretisation of relationships in space, meaning that the way that we relate is expressed in our architecture, and architecture talks. Architects ourselves talk in space, and it's that language of space that we need to kind of understand. So I'm going to borrow now from the work of Professor Peter Collar at New South Wales University. Peter's no longer with us, but what he taught us 35 years ago still, as I said, resonates with my current practice. Let me take you through the fundamentals of the language of space. The first is the point, the primordial point. This is the prime characteristic of space that contains within it all the potential of space. It has no dimension of its own, but from that point, everything else originates. As we move from a single point, we begin extension. Literally, to stand apart, existence, or to stand apart, is the definition of existence. To stand apart from the primordial point, to be able to measure something separate from that. Once we start moving apart, we're moving in direction, and direction implies purpose. From direction, we start to achieve rotation, and that rotation is first two-dimensional as we experiment with different directions, but then it becomes three-dimensional as we rotate that in a new dimension into the third dimension, and we start to create volume, and that's where space itself really starts to come into being. And then finally, from that, we see the fulfillment of that spatial dynamic with the treatment of surface. So let's just take each of those individually, and I'll show you a couple of examples perhaps of how that might find expression in an architectural work. First of all, as I said, the point, it's primordial. Pre-order is really what that means when I say primordial. It's the pre-existent, standing before order. It contains within itself all the potential from which space will fill out. The point itself remains undefined. It's without limits. It has no boundaries. It occupies no space, but is complete in itself. And it's that from which everything else is measured. Now, throughout various traditions in history, we find the significance of the point, and we see how architects in particular have sought to search, to express, and to use the power of the primordial point. If we again just refer back to our rail museum, we see there that the point becomes the intersection of a series of axes by which this building connects back into the community that it represents. And at the junction of that point, we create a very special place. There are other special places within the building. There are other dynamics and movements within the building, but this particular point is amongst the most special, and from which the rest of the building derives its significance. As I said, the axes that define that point start to locate that point in space. Come from the community on the right, comes up from the railway station down to the bottom, resonates back out into the ordering of this site and other parts of the mill town at which this museum was an anchor piece. And you see that, in fact, on opening night, the place that the opening ceremony was held from, the place where people gathered, and now that the building is open and people arrive here, this is the place where people take their first impression of actually being in this building, and from which all that movement occurs. The next is extension. As I said, this actually is the point at which existence comes into being. We start to measure ourselves against that primordial point by how far apart from it we stand. Everything within existence is referenced back to that original point. Extension is the measurement of relativity. It's the measurement of being itself. It's a very existential characteristic of space. it's a quantifiable thing, and therefore it's no longer infinite. So where the point was not finite, once we start to work with extension, we're starting to deal with the finite. There are decisions to be made. There are consequences. There are, as I said, measurable things. And so it brings with it power, force, potential, and value in this existential form. And so here's a jetty that runs right through the middle of my farmhouse, and we have run this as a guest house just out of Bathurst. And when you take a yachtsman away from Sydney Harbour and stick them in the middle of rural New South Wales, I find that the jetty to be a sort of a comforting kind of feature. But here, this architectural element drives its way right through the centre of relatively small cottage. This notional jetty misses our water supply, the sort of large lake, about a kilometre in distance and about 100 metres in elevation. But it creates this experience on the left, and to a degree, my daughter's expression of it on the right. I market this place as being a place where you can actually come for an existential experience in the country, suspended in space somewhat between the end of this jetty and the water, much more relating to the sky, or as much relating to the sky as the water that it misses. And so the extension through the house here creates this existential experience, and that is the experience that people find when they get there. But extension happens in a direction, and direction implies purpose. It's fixed by the point, but it's distinguished and it's measured now relative to other alternatives, other options. We're starting to bring in value judgments and intent. We're starting to imply movement toward or away. And so at that point, we're actually starting to explore emotions, because our emotions are quite technically, and by definition, our emotions are a felt tendency towards something or a repulsion away from something. And so once we start to contemplate direction, then we're in this space, this emotional space. We're moving people, we're lifting their eyes to different experiences, and so direction becomes important. In a very simple kind of form here, you see another of our buildings in Uganda where, and you see the building in its form up the top right there, but you see a strange shift in the central image here, where in fact the front wall of the building has been rotated through about 10 degrees, so that the building faces one direction but the front wall faces another, and that's deliberately done here to invite and welcome people towards an entrance, even though the building is participating in a bigger context and participating with other things. And so that shift is not entirely arbitrary. That shift is actually deliberate about forming this attraction toward and an invitation, a welcoming invitation towards the reception area. And so then we end up with rotation, where we start to introduce this extra dimensional. We get movement around the point, and so we get greater perception of the primordial point as we begin to move around it. We build our understanding and our knowledge of the whole universe as we start to move around. There's a greater realisation of our being, and we establish in this a dynamic stability. So as the Earth rotates, that's what creates its stability. It's what creates gravity that holds us all from falling off the edge of it. And this rotation becomes important both in our experience and our perception. But architecturally, it also helps us establish, in that stability, we start to establish a sense of settlement, of gathering and some comfort that comes with that. And so we see that expressed in, say, Aboriginal iconography. Here's one of the typical symbols from Aboriginal art, where the sense of community is being expressed here by the gathering around, and we talk about gathering around because this rotational geometry, the aroundness is actually very often about this sort of gathering. In the same way, this is the church here in Bathurst that we're involved in recreating. This was this same old Presbyterian church that had pews lined up in rows and very formal, ordered experience where people would come, they'd sit quietly, and then they'd go away after participating in some sort of ceremony. And as this church is contemplating its mission in the 21st century, they wanted to reorder those relationships. And so the seats have been brought into a curvilinear form to gather around, to gather together, to celebrate that gathering of people. But more than that, in this instance, it's a semicircle because the church's mission is not yet finished, and so the rest of that gathering is still to be complete. There are all sorts of geometrical implications, as you can imagine, in moving seats around in a very linear building, and so we were very conscious of the strong existing axes and very subtle shifts in those and changes in that dynamic so that when you sit in the building, it's still comfortable. And then finally, the fulfillment of all of this is achieved through the addition of surface. At this point, we see the embodiment of the space that we've been creating. At this point, it becomes fully defined. Its potential is realised. And there's a sense in which there's now no longer any more options. Our decisions have been made. It's the end of chaos. Now, chaos is an interesting word, of course, because the Greeks saw chaos as being all of the unlimited potential at the beginning of the process, and they mourn the loss of the chaos because the chaos is that potential to be explored and to be played amongst. And so by the time we reach this sort of fulfillment, those options have now been defined. Chaos is gone, and the potentiality is gone. That asks all sorts of interesting questions, I think, of those of us who now work in a postmodern world and with a deconstructivist influence, where we enjoy still pulling things apart and seeing what the relationships are when they're pulled apart. And so there's a restlessness perhaps in our society about having reached any kind of fulfillment. But there's also, I think, a danger that very often as architects, particularly when we're following trends, we could start at this end of the process. We could be passionate about particular materiality. We could be excited about particular shapes and forms. And if we start here, we actually miss all of the decision-making process and all of the opportunity that's captured in the other parts of the language of space before we arrive at this completed point. And so I guess my challenge to you is to think through each of those elements of the language of space and to work with each of them deliberately for the benefit and the purpose that each of them brings, rather than just jumping to a trendy kind of conclusion. Because while architecture may not achieve world peace, we actually do have a greater purpose and a greater opportunity of expressing that purpose than simply being part of a beauty pageant. And so I'll stop there now, and we can open this into perhaps more of a simple forum. Let me stop that share. We'll go back to seeing each other's faces. And I'm happy to sort of take questions. There's much more I could say about all of that, and there's some expression of it in another culture that I'm happy to work through, but let's take some questions first.
Thanks so much for that, Tony. It was fascinating, actually. It was really wonderful to be taken through that journey of the fundamental elements of the language of space and how it does influence our emotions and relationships to space. It was delightful, thank you. I'd like to invite all of anyone within the audience to submit any questions via the chat function. But in the meantime, while you're thinking of questions to ask Tony, prior to or at registration, many of you did actually submit some questions, which, Tony, if you don't mind, I'll run through some of those with you now, just to start the conversation. The first question, I guess, relates to a common problem that architects have in trying to win projects. They're often up against building designers or draftspeople. So the question that's been put to you tonight is, how do you pitch your architectural services to a client when you're in competition in terms of fees with those other potentially less experienced people or professionals? I guess much of what you've described at the start of a project represent the less tangible elements of the built product. So, how do you get the clients over the line at the start of the project?
Yeah, I think the challenge for our profession is to build that understanding that we're doing something entirely different than those other offerings. If we're just simply competing on price to make the latest trendy building, then it's going to be a very difficult, very hard race. Architecture is promoted by great buildings that work really well, and the more of those we do, the more architects will get a look in. We have to discipline ourselves to just move away from competing at the trendy shape. We need to educate our client base around purpose and meaning, operational function. We need to be astute about those things. We need to work with them in that understanding of what it is they're trying to achieve with their building at all of those levels, and have that conversation with them so that they simply appreciate that that's a conversation they don't get to have with anybody else, and they end up with buildings that work better than with anybody else, and particularly buildings that work at that emotional, esoteric kind of genuine, full depth kind of level.
Yeah, it often ends up being, establishing a relationship with your potential client up front, and often it's the case, isn't it, that you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. You want a client who understands and is supportive of your approach as well.
And we've found our clients come to us and our clients return to us because we have those conversations with them. They understand that they're talking with an architect, and it's about space and place and purpose and character. It's not just about their next building.
Yeah, and you mentioned also that it's important to have those elements within the budget. That it isn't just about fancy joinery and tapware and that sort of thing. That actually being able to include those important aspects that represent purpose within the budget. Someone else has asked how you think the role of architects will change in our new pandemic-altered reality, and what this might mean for the future of the profession.
I don't want to be too glib and say it's a great opportunity, but the reality is that whenever disruption comes and people are arrested in their day-to-day and have to stop and think about purpose and meaning, that's where the arts and architecture as one of the greatest arts, because it covers from science and technology right through to the world of ideas. It's where architecture has a lot to offer. We will find ourselves in a position where people are asking questions that we will want to engage them with. We need to be ready for those conversations, and we need to be offering something into that circumstance. Now, the danger, of course, is that people retreat into simple existence but we find that very unsatisfying. You find yourself in Melbourne at the moment in lockdown. Existence isn't a lot of fun, and at some point you need more than just that, and the delight and the purpose and the meaning of architecture indeed has something to offer. It comes down to the responsibility of the architect, I guess, to be clear about those things that we're offering and that way that we're thinking.
Someone in the audience has just asked, you said that following trends in materiality and form means you lose the opportunities in the decision-making process. Can you suggest any good literature, books or works to look at to further inform that decision-making process?
Great question. And the answer is no, because I don't get to read enough at the moment. I've recently transitioned from being a director of our business to working in the space of thought leadership, and that brings with it a responsibility to start to find some references of that type. So I will take that on notice. I guess what my presentation was about is about architects thinking in that bigger picture way. Material science is a part of our work, but it's only a part of our work, and it's a part of our work that's very easily specialised off to somebody else, and we then lose that. So we need to understand material science. We need to know the materials that we're working with, and sometimes those materials will inspire us to want to do something with them. But my point, I guess, is that if that's all that we do, then we're a technician more than an artist, and we need to keep those things in balance.
I'd like to thank Maya for that question. Sorry, Maya, I didn't mention your name initially. We've got some more questions that were asked at registration. How can our practice transcend its commercial nature and perform on more socially driven platforms?
Yes. Architecture has to be a business, and businesses have to make profit, because that's how you get to be in business again tomorrow. It's how you get to develop your business, is through making profit. And so we should never be afraid of that. Some of us are not so good at it, so you need to align yourselves with people who are. Sorry, could you repeat the question? Because I think I just distracted myself.
That's all right. It was just, I think you've partly answered it. How can our practice transcend its commercial nature and perform on more socially driven platforms?
Yes, it is a question of believing in something yourself, and then finding the ways that belief structure influences what you do. Now this is difficult for I'm going to be an old man at this point. This generation, your generation, has grown up in a much more pluralist world than I did. When I was a child, there was still truth and meaning and purpose, and those things have been challenged and questioned. And even the President of the United States now kind of is playing silly games with truth. But there is truth and purpose and meaning, and you guys actually do all care about things. That's why the question's been asked. You see a world that needs all sorts of things. You want to be part of its repair and its custodianship, and so you ask the question, and so my answer is to understand what you believe in, for that belief to be in something that is well-founded, and has a historical continuum standing behind it, and that is worth investment of all your time and effort, and then that will actually naturally flow through into your profession and therefore out through your business. And so I was, I guess, blessed as a uni student to be able to align my Christian faith with my architectural understanding, and so these things have, my profession of faith and my profession have been hand in hand throughout my career, and our clients understand that, That's part of the reason they come to us, not to do Christian buildings, but because they understand the principles on which we stand and the kinds of things that we will bring to them, and the integrity with which we'll work. And so your life isn't divided into separate compartments. You as a whole person will bear influence with your character through everything that you do, and you need to see architecture as a stunningly good opportunity for you to express yourself, your purpose, your meaning, your belief in what you do.
I guess that's a thing that keeps architects practicing for so long. If they didn't have that, it would really be a challenge, I think.
It's either that or it's having to pay for the professional indemnity insurance, and it's not worth working just for that.
Most definitely not. A related question is there an organisation or volunteer program for young architects to participate in to help rural and Indigenous communities?
Great question. There isn't one that I'm aware of, but it makes me think that there ought to be, and perhaps that's something for me to think about next week. There are organisations, Architects Without Borders. I think it is Architects.
There's Architects Without Frontiers as well, I think.
Frontiers does some work in that space. Where I'm engaged with an organisation called EMI, Engineering Ministries International, out of the United States. They have offices around the world, and they bring building professionals into circumstances where such influences would not normally be. And they're an exceptionally good organisation, and we do some great work with them. Our work in Uganda is in partnership with them. And in fact, when I've finished here, I'm joining a video link to Uganda this evening to present the next stage of one of the schools there. So yeah, EMI is worth looking up on a website and seeing what they're up to. There's work coming out of University of Melbourne and MIT, I think, and out of Adelaide, where they have particularly strong relationships with some of the Aboriginal communities and some work, and so they have specific design schools related to that. So there is a number of people out there. I know the work that Paul Falleris was doing before he passed away a year or two ago is having a significant influence in those areas. And there are a number like him. There's a guy whose name I've forgotten out of Perth with a practice not unlike ours, who's been working in Aboriginal housing for 35, 40 years. So architects have been on the ground in those spaces. And if that's part of your passion, I'd encourage you to keep up that search and find the organisation that fits with you and your passion and that you can contribute to. And I think it's a good practice to work in a pro bono way. You have to work hard to make money in other areas, and then you have the opportunity then of using those resources to share with other people who wouldn't ordinarily see them. The other thing I guess I'd encourage architects to do is to move out of just the eastern suburbs. There is life west of York Street in Sydney. I'm not sure what the Melbourne equivalent is, but engage with the broadest part of society as you can. Because we become well educated, we become familiar and comfortable in with certain aesthetics, certain styles, certain ways of thinking. We can very easily become snobbish. We become very dismissive of the suburbs in particular. I'm certainly quite critical of them, but I've lived in them and I understand them, and I seek to continue to understand them and to understand what it is that people live in them for, so that our practice can make a meaningful contribution. So a lot of our work has been in northwest and southwest Sydney in the growth centres, creating suburbs and whole estate layouts together with the houses that fit within them, within the sensibilities of a project construction industry and understanding their cost centres, but creating great spaces for people, great places, great communities. And those things are actually based on those principles that I've been outlining today of of understanding the three-dimensionality, pardon me, understanding the gathering of people around. So we're working with project builders even this week for them to create communities rather than just suburbs. There's a lot of work for architects to do in that space. 20 years ago, when 15 years ago, we picked up the Premier's Award in New South Wales within the Institute of Architects Awards for a suburb in Western Sydney, and half of the room fell over kind of laughing that an architect would even be dealing with such things. The other half of the room, I think, understood that there was a whole lot of work to be done out there.
Wow. Well, with all of the experience you have with the design of community spaces, what do you think are the key architectural elements of these spaces that make them truly meaningful and accessible to those using them?
I think it is what I was showing in my presentation. It's the understanding of those elements that help people realise their existence relative to some central. Maybe it's a central part of that building, or maybe it's a bigger statement than that. Greek temples, the Parthenon, Pantheon, all of those, were actually the Stonehenge. All of these built things in history have sought to relate mankind within a cosmic kind of order, and so we need to think in those terms. But then we need to use those tools to kind of measure ourselves relative to those, to consider the directions that we're heading relative to others, and how's that expressed as we approach buildings and as we move through them, and then how are we gathering people together for in that comfort and serenity of the realisation of what we're making.
So as architects, as problem solvers, how do you think architects can assist with solving some of the problems exposed during the pandemic in our society? I'm assuming that office spaces are going to be designed differently in the future. We've got to consider things such as hygiene, social distancing, remote working, flexible home spaces to suit the exact situation that we're in at the moment, in having to work and live in the one space. Do you think architects play a big role in that future?
I think when all of those things that we've taken for granted for so long are about to be suddenly reinvented, it's a very important space for architects to be. That said, I would caution us against sudden reactive behaviour. There's great danger that we will jump on a particular bandwagon and just because there's an opportunity for work, we'll start reinventing workspaces without thinking through, what's the trajectory on which we have been that's brought us to the position that we were in. What were the good things that we were trying to achieve in open plan offices and in communal spaces and in breakout areas? What are the important parts of a house that enable us to relate to our community? I think one of the great things that I've observed through the period of lockdown is that people have suddenly rediscovered their front porch, their front path, and even the place where they put their garbage bin. These things are now valuable things because these are the places where we connect with the community. That's a great interruption from my point of view, just a stunningly beautiful interruption from our retreat into the backyard, where we had been becoming more and more individualist and isolationist, and now that we've been forced into isolation, we're yearning and searching for those connections again. And so architects need to think in those terms, need to think about the trajectory of history. What were we trying to achieve? What was actually not good for us anyway? What's been brought into clearer focus? And then take a steady and considered view as to how we might now reinvent all of those things into a different world order. As I said, very careful not to just throw out the baby with the bathwater, not to be opportunists, but actually to take a big, intelligent, thoughtful view of what are the needs of our community as we move forward.
which really just sums up the message that you've given us tonight, to design with purpose, and to carefully consider all of the language of architecture, which is wonderful. If nobody else has any other questions, seeing any there, I'd also like to remind you that Tony has actually spoken at another of our daytime lean-ins with Michael Linky, and there is a recording available of that if you'd like to hear a little bit more about Tony's work. Madeline has kindly put that up in the chat, the link to that the link to that lean-in up in the chat if you'd like to have a look at that. So I just, Tony, if there's nothing else you'd like to chat about, we have a few more minutes left if you'd like to mention anything else.
I think I'm pleased to have this opportunity to talk particularly to students and recent graduates, and I have throughout the period of running our own office and as I've developed experience, I work very closely with students and young graduates who often reach that kind of slightly disillusioned phase and wonder what it is that they're getting themselves into and whether it was worth all the effort. Our friends have all graduated in accounting careers and earning the big bucks, and we're still doing all-nighters to make it through a course. And my encouragement to you is to understand that architecture can be practiced with purpose and with vigour, and it brings with it delight and joy. The relationships we develop with our clients are fulfilling and rewarding, and it is, it's at least a great hobby if it's not a great profession. And so don't kind of throw it in. Do enter the profession with great vigour and passion, with all the insights that you bring, and see yourself in a place in history, not alone, but in a continuum of architectural thought that's run over many, many thousands of years. Be a student of that history, and then invent the new things for the future.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Tony. I'm sure that our viewers have appreciated all your advice and inspiration. So I'd just like to thank you on behalf of everybody. Thank everybody for joining us tonight, and I encourage you to join us again next week for next week's lean-in. Thank you again. Thank you to SONA and EmAGN, and I hope you all have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thanks,
Tony.
All the best.